New York in the late 1920s was a city that moved fast. During the day, the streets were packed with people. Taxis honked, streetcars rattled along their tracks. Newspaper boys shouted headlines on the corners, and everywhere you looked there were crowds. But if you walked through the city very late at night, things felt different. The noise softened. The lights of the shops slowly turned off. A quiet wind sometimes drifted between the tall buildings. It was in those quiet hours that New York felt almost peaceful. Almost, because beneath the busy life of the city, another world existed. A hidden one. Most people never saw it, and those who did usually pretended they had not. You see, New York was not just the biggest city in America. It was also the center of immigration. Millions of people from across Europe had come here looking for a new life. Ships arrived every week carrying families from Italy, Ireland, Germany, Russia, and many other places. For many immigrants, the first sight of New York Harbor was unforgettable. The tall buildings, the busy docks, the Statue of Liberty standing quietly in the distance. It felt like the beginning of something hopeful. Many Italian immigrants settled in neighborhoods where they could speak their own language and find familiar food. One of the most famous was Little Italy in Manhattan. The streets there were narrow and lively. Shops sold fresh bread, olive oil, and cheese. The smell of garlic and tomato sauce floated through the air from small restaurants. Old men played cards outside cafes while arguing loudly about politics or football. Children ran through the streets chasing each other between parked carts and wagons. Life was not always easy. Many families worked long hours in factories, on construction sites, or at the docks. But there was pride in building a new life. Brooklyn also had growing Italian neighborhoods, streets lined with bakeries, butcher shops, and small grocery stores. Families lived close together. Everyone knew everyone, at least. That is how it seemed. Because hidden inside some of these neighborhoods was a different network, one that most people preferred not to talk about. These networks were connected to a long tradition that came from southern Italy and Sicily. Back in the villages of Sicily, local groups had formed long ago to protect communities when government power was weak. These groups often helped settle disputes. They offered protection to businesses. And sometimes they enforced their own version of justice. Over time, these groups became organized. Very organized. And eventually, the name that many people used for them was simple: the Mafia. Now, it is important to remember that most Italian immigrants had nothing to do with the Mafia. They worked hard and avoided trouble whenever possible. But within every large community, there are always a few men who see opportunity in places others do not. New York offered many opportunities, especially for people willing to bend the law a little, or break it completely. Illegal gambling operations quietly appeared behind ordinary storefronts. A small cafe might look normal during the day, but at night, a back room could fill with men playing cards and placing bets. There were also protection rackets. A shop owner might receive a friendly visit from a well-dressed man who explained that his business could be protected. For a small weekly payment, nothing bad would happen to the shop. No broken windows, no mysterious fires. Most shop owners understood the offer very quickly, because if they refused, accidents sometimes followed. A smashed window, a delivery truck that suddenly stopped arriving. Maybe a group of unpleasant men standing outside the store looking bored. These small messages usually worked. and slowly, quietly, the men behind these operations built networks of power across neighborhoods. Meetings happened in cafes, social clubs, and restaurants. Sometimes a decision affecting an entire neighborhood could be made during a long dinner filled with wine and pasta. The conversations were quiet, the agreements even quieter, and above all, there was one rule: silence. Many Italian communities use the word omerta. It meant a code of silence. You did not talk about the organization, not to the police, not to strangers, sometimes not even to your friends. You saw nothing, you heard nothing. And life continued peacefully. For many years, this hidden system worked. But by the late 1920s, something was changing. The criminal world of New York was growing bigger, much bigger. And when power grows, conflict often follows. At the center of this coming conflict stood two powerful men. One was a strong and stubborn mafia boss who had built his reputation through years of violence and loyalty. His name was Giuseppe Masseria. Many people simply called him Joe the Boss. Across the city, another man was quietly building his own organization, a calm and calculating leader from Sicily named Salvatore Maranzano. For a time, these two men existed in the same underworld without open conflict. But New York was becoming too crowded with power. Soon their organizations would collide, and when they did, the quiet streets of the mafia world would turn into a battlefield. Historians would later call the conflict the Castellamarese War. But in the late 1920s, most people in New York had no idea that such a storm was slowly forming. The city looked peaceful enough, just another busy night in New York. Before the coming war, the mafia in New York had already existed for many years. Its roots stretched back to the early 1900s. At that time, small criminal groups had formed among immigrant communities. Many of these groups were loosely organized. Some focused on gambling, others on extortion. But a few leaders began building more powerful organizations. One of the earliest figures in this world was Giuseppe Morello. Morello was known for being both clever and ruthless. He had arrived in New York from Sicily and slowly built a network of criminal activity. His group controlled extortion rackets and counterfeit money operations. Morello and his associates became one of the first organized mafia groups in the city. Working closely with him was another feared figure, Ignazio Lupo. Lupo was often called the Wolf, and many people thought the name fit him very well. He had a reputation for being dangerous and unpredictable. Stories about him spread through the Italian neighborhoods, sometimes growing larger with each retelling. Together, Morello and Lupo helped shape the early structure of the mafia in New York. Their organizations operated through loyalty. Members followed a strict code. They respected their leaders, and betrayal was never tolerated. Over time, other mafia groups formed across the city. Each had its own leader. Each controlled certain territories and businesses. Some focused on gambling. Others ran protection rackets or smuggling operations. Conflicts occasionally happened between groups, but large wars were rare. The leaders understood something important. Violence brought attention, and attention from the police was never good for business. So most disputes were settled quietly, sometimes over dinner, sometimes through careful negotiation, and sometimes through methods that were less peaceful. But by the 1920s, the old generation of mafia leaders was beginning to fade. Some had been arrested, others had lost power. New leaders were rising to take their place, and one of the most powerful of these rising bosses was a man who would soon dominate New York's underworld. A man named Joe the Boss. The man who would become one of the most powerful mafia leaders in New York began life far away from the city. Giuseppe Masseria was born in Sicily in the late 1800s. Like many immigrants of his time, he eventually traveled to the United States looking for opportunity. And New York certainly had opportunities. Some were honest, others less so. Masseria was a large man with a heavy build. He enjoyed good food and was known to eat very large meals. In fact, some people joked that if there was free pasta nearby, Masseria would somehow appear. But behind his love of food was a man who understood power. He slowly built connections within the growing mafia networks of New York. At first, he worked under older leaders, learning the structure of the organization, understanding how loyalty and influence worked in the criminal world. Masseria was not known as a brilliant strategist, but he was tough, and toughness could go a long way in the underworld. Over time, he gathered loyal followers around him. Many younger gangsters saw him as a strong leader who protected his own people. By the mid-1920s, Masseria had become one of the dominant bosses in New York. His influence stretched across large parts of the city, and many other mafia figures were forced to deal with him carefully. Some worked with him, others feared him, but few ignored him. Masseria enjoyed the status of being one of the most powerful figures in the Italian criminal world of New York. But power rarely remains uncontested forever, because across the Atlantic, and soon across the streets of New York itself, another leader was rising. A man who believed he should be the one guiding the future of the mafia. His name was Salvatore Maranzano. And the moment these two powerful men stood on opposite sides of the same battlefield, the old balance of New York's underworld would begin to collapse. The storm was coming, and the city would never be quite the same again. Far across the Atlantic Ocean, on the northern coast of Sicily, there is a small fishing town called Castellamarese del Golfo. It is a quiet place. Fishing boats rest in the harbor. Narrow streets wind between old stone houses. The air smells of salt, sea wind, and sometimes freshly caught fish. Life there moved slowly for many generations. Families knew each other for decades. Traditions passed from one generation to the next. And like many towns in Sicily, during the late 1800s and early 1900s, Castellamarese had its own connections to the secret societies of the island. Among the young men growing up in this town was someone who would later play a major role in the history of American organized crime. His name was Salvatore Maranzano. Maranzano was very different from the loud and heavy Joe Masseria. He was thinner, more reserved, often calm in conversation. Some people even describe him as scholarly. He liked reading and studying history. In fact, Maranzano was fascinated by ancient Rome and the strategies of Roman generals. Not exactly the hobby most people expect from a mafia boss, but Maranzano believed that leadership required discipline and structure. He admired the organization of Roman armies and sometimes spoke about it when explaining how power should work. Of course, not everyone wanted a history lecture while discussing crime, but still, people listened. Because Maranzano had another quality that mattered very much in the underworld. He was patient, and patient men can be very dangerous. Like many Sicilians at the time, Maranzano eventually traveled to the United States. America was full of opportunity. And New York, in particular, was becoming a center for Italian immigrant communities. When Maranzano arrived, he did not come alone. Over time, many immigrants from Castellamarese del Golfo followed the same path to America. They settled in New York and formed tight communities. People from the same hometown often trusted each other deeply. They spoke the same dialect, shared the same traditions, and in the criminal world, that kind of trust was extremely valuable. Soon, a network of men from Castellamarese began forming their own faction within New York's mafia circles. These men became known as the Castellamarese, and their leader was Maranzano. He built his organization carefully, slowly. He avoided unnecessary attention and worked quietly behind the scenes. While Joe Masseria controlled large parts of the underworld through force and reputation, Maranzano preferred strategy. He studied his rivals. He built alliances. And he waited. For a while, the two organizations existed side by side in the city. They were aware of each other, but they did not immediately clash. But something else was happening in America at the same time. Something that would bring enormous wealth to criminals across the country. And once that money began flowing, the peaceful balance of the mafia would not last long. In 1920, the United States government made a decision that would change the criminal world forever. It passed a law banning the production and sale of alcohol. This era became known as Prohibition in the United States. The idea behind Prohibition was simple. Some politicians believed alcohol caused crime and social problems. If alcohol disappeared, they thought, society would become healthier and more peaceful. In theory, it sounded reasonable. In reality, well, things did not go quite as planned. Because people did not suddenly stop wanting alcohol, not even a little bit. Restaurants quietly served wine to trusted customers. Secret bars called speakeasies opened behind hidden doors, and smugglers began transporting liquor across borders and along coastlines. Bootlegging became a huge business, and criminals quickly realized something very important. Selling illegal alcohol could make an unbelievable amount of money. Suddenly, organized crime groups across America were earning fortunes. Trucks filled with liquor drove through the night. Warehouses stored thousands of bottles. Ships smuggled alcohol into harbors, and every step of the operation needed protection. Which meant the mafia became deeply involved. New York, with its massive population and busy port, became one of the biggest bootlegging centers in the country. Money flowed through the underworld like never before. Gambling and protection rackets were still profitable, but alcohol smuggling was something different. It was a gold mine. Of course, whenever huge amounts of money appear, competition follows. Different criminal groups fought for control of distribution routes, warehouses, and speakeasies. Some arguments were settled quietly. Others ended with gunfire. Joe Masseria understood the value of this new business very quickly. His organization moved into bootlegging operations across New York. But Maranzano and the Castellamarese faction also saw the opportunity. Both sides wanted a piece of the growing fortune. And soon, the tension between the two powerful bosses began to rise. At first, it was small things. Disagreements over territory, arguments about business deals, rumors that one side was interfering with the other. Nothing dramatic yet. But small tensions can grow quickly in the criminal world, especially when pride is involved. And both Masseria and Maranzano had plenty of pride. The stage was slowly being set for something much larger than a simple dispute. Soon, the Mafia would no longer be a collection of quiet groups sharing the same city. It would divide into two rival camps, and once that happened, violence would be impossible to avoid. By the late 1920s, the tension inside New York's Mafia world had reached a dangerous level. The underworld was beginning to split. On one side stood the powerful organization of Joe Masseria. Masseria had built his reputation over many years. He controlled large crews of gangsters and had influence in many neighborhoods. Many older Mafia members respected his authority. Some feared him, and quite a few simply believed it was safer to stay on his side. But across the city, the Castellamarese faction, led by Maranzano, was growing stronger. More immigrants from Castellamarese were arriving in New York. Many joined Maranzano's network. They were loyal to him, not only as a leader, but also as a fellow townsman. Trust ran deep among them. Soon the Mafia was no longer one loose community of organizations. It was becoming two rival groups. And inside these groups were younger gangsters who were watching everything very carefully. One of these rising figures was a young and ambitious criminal named Charles Lucky Luciano. Luciano had grown up in New York after arriving from Sicily as a child. He was smart, observant, and much more modern in his thinking than the older generation of Mafia bosses. Luciano believed the criminal world should operate more like a business. Less about old Sicilian traditions, more about profit and efficiency. He worked closely with other rising gangsters, including Vito Genovese and Joe Adonis. These younger men respected the power of leaders like Masseria and Maranzano. But they also saw the problems. Too much tradition, too many old rivalries, too many leaders who refused to adapt to the changing world of organized crime. Still, the younger generation kept their thoughts mostly private. For now, survival meant loyalty, and loyalty meant choosing a side. As the underworld divided, Luciano and many others aligned themselves with Joe Masseria. At least, for the moment. Across New York, the two factions began preparing for what many suspected was coming. Meetings took place in quiet restaurants. Loyal gunmen were recruited. Trusted associates were given new instructions. Everyone understood that a confrontation was getting closer, but nobody knew exactly when the first shot would be fired. The streets of New York continued their normal rhythm. Taxis rolled through Manhattan. Families gathered for dinner in Brooklyn. Restaurants filled with laughter and conversation. Yet, behind the calm surface of the city, something far more dangerous was building. Two powerful Mafia leaders were moving slowly toward a war that would change the structure of organized crime forever. And once the violence began, there would be no easy way to stop it. The Castellamarese War was about to begin. By the year 1930, the quiet balance of New York's Mafia world was beginning to fall apart. For years, the criminal organizations of the city had managed to exist in a careful sort of peace. Not exactly friendship, of course. Nobody in the Mafia world would describe it that way. But there had been an understanding. Everyone had their territory. Everyone had their businesses. And if problems appeared, the bosses usually tried to settle them quietly. But now, the underworld had split into two rival camps. On one side stood the organization of Giuseppe Masseria. On the other stood the growing Castellamarese faction, led by Salvatore Maranzano. Each man believed he should be the most powerful mafia leader in New York, and neither man was interested in sharing that position. At first, the conflict moved slowly. Quiet arguments, rumors spreading through social clubs, messages passed between trusted associates. But sooner or later, disagreements in the mafia world tend to follow a predictable path. First come the insults, then the threats, and eventually, the bullets. The exact moment when the Castellamarese War truly began is difficult to pinpoint. These conflicts rarely start with a clear announcement. There was no official declaration, no dramatic speech, just a series of violent events that slowly revealed what was happening. A gunman waiting outside a cafe. A car pulling up beside a rival's building late at night. A sudden burst of gunfire echoing down a dark street. And after each attack, people in the neighborhood would look out their windows, shake their heads, and quietly close the curtains again. Because asking questions about these things was never a good idea. Members of both factions began targeting rivals. Sometimes the victims were important leaders. Other times they were simply loyal soldiers who happened to belong to the wrong side. The streets of New York did not suddenly turn into open battlefields. The war was quieter than that, more like a shadow war. Attacks happened quickly, often without witnesses, and the gunmen disappeared just as fast. Restaurants that once hosted friendly meetings now held tense conversations. Social clubs filled with whispers. Everywhere there was a feeling of uncertainty. Nobody knew who might be targeted next. Even powerful bosses became cautious. Some avoided traveling alone, others changed their routines or moved between safe houses. Of course, Joe Masseria was not the type of man who liked to appear afraid. He continued to move through the city surrounded by loyal followers. But even he understood that the situation had become dangerous because the man he was facing was patient, very patient, and patience can win wars. Across the city, Maranzano and his Castellamarese supporters were preparing for a long conflict. They believed time was on their side. Meanwhile, the younger gangsters working under Masseria were beginning to feel uneasy because wars are expensive. They interrupt business, they attract police attention, and they create chaos that makes it difficult to earn money. For men who believed organized crime should run like a profitable business, this constant violence was becoming very frustrating. One of those men was someone who would soon change the entire structure of the mafia, a young gangster named Charles Luciano. During the early months of the war, New York continued to look normal on the surface. Trains still rattled across bridges. Crowds still filled the markets of Little Italy, and restaurants remained busy late into the night. But within the mafia world, life had changed dramatically. Everything felt tense. Meetings were shorter. Conversations were quieter. Trust became a rare and valuable thing. Even simple gatherings required caution. A group of men might sit around a restaurant table sharing a meal, but their eyes constantly scanned the room. Was that man by the door just another customer? Or was he waiting for someone? Paranoia slowly crept into everyday life. Cars sometimes followed other cars through the streets, trying to see who was traveling where. Gunmen waited inside parked vehicles for hours. Patience was part of the job. Sometimes they waited so long they grew bored. One can only sit inside a car for so many hours before wondering if there might be a better career choice somewhere in the world. But loyalty kept them there. Across the city, social clubs served as meeting places for mafia members. These clubs looked ordinary from the outside. A small sign, a quiet doorway, maybe a few men smoking outside. Inside, however, important discussions took place. Plans were made, warnings were delivered, and sometimes arguments became heated. Nobody fully trusted anyone anymore. The war had turned the underworld into a maze of shifting alliances. Friends today might become enemies tomorrow, and every decision carried risk. Meanwhile, the police occasionally heard rumors about the growing violence. But organized crime in New York was complicated. The mafia operated through silence and loyalty. Witnesses were rare. Without witnesses, investigations moved slowly, and the war continued in the shadows. During this time, Joe Masseria still held enormous power. Many powerful crews remained loyal to him, but not everyone was satisfied with the situation. Some of the younger gangsters believed the old leadership was creating unnecessary chaos. Instead of building profitable businesses, they were fighting over pride and tradition. And that frustration was quietly growing. Among the younger figures in the mafia world, one man stood out for his intelligence and ambition. His name was Charles Lucky Luciano. Luciano had arrived in New York from Sicily as a child. He grew up on the streets of the city and learned quickly how power worked in the criminal world. Unlike many older mafia bosses, Luciano was comfortable working with people from different backgrounds. He partnered with Jewish gangsters. He worked with Irish criminals. To Luciano, business was business. And if someone could make money, it did not matter where they came from. This modern thinking was very different from the old traditions of the mafia. Many older leaders insisted that only Sicilians could truly be trusted. Luciano thought that idea was outdated. After all, if someone could help you make a fortune, why reject them just because the grandmother cooked different food? It seemed like an unnecessary limitation. Luciano worked closely with several rising figures, including Vito Genovese and Joe Adonis. Together, they represented a new generation of organized crime leaders. They wanted stability, they wanted profits, and they wanted the mafia to operate more like a modern corporation. The ongoing war between Masseria and Maranzano looked very different from that vision. To Luciano, it felt like an old-fashioned power struggle that was costing everyone money. While the bosses fought over who should rule, businesses suffered. Bootlegging operations became risky. Gambling networks faced interruptions. Police attention increased. In other words, the war was bad for business. Luciano began quietly thinking about the future. What if the mafia did not need one powerful boss controlling everything? What if there was a system where different families shared power and settled disputes through discussion instead of constant violence? It was a radical idea for the time. And implementing such a change would not be easy, because first, the war had to end. And wars in the mafia world rarely end through peaceful negotiation. More often, they end when one leader falls. As the conflict between Masseria and Maranzano continued, Luciano and others began quietly considering a dangerous possibility. Perhaps the future of organized crime required removing the old leadership entirely. For now, those thoughts remained private, but they would not stay secret forever, because the Castellamarese War was slowly moving toward its most dramatic turning point. And when that moment arrived, the entire structure of the mafia would change. The old order was beginning to crumble, and a new one, was waiting in the shadows. By the middle of 1930, the war inside New York's mafia world had already lasted many months. Gunfire had echoed through quiet streets. Rivals had disappeared without warning. Loyal soldiers on both sides had been lost. And yet, the war was still far from finished. At first, many people believed the powerful organization of Giuseppe Masseria would eventually win. Masseria had ruled large parts of the underworld for years. His network of crews stretched across the city. Many older mafia members still respected him. But wars rarely follow simple predictions. Slowly, almost quietly, the balance of power began to shift. Across the city, the forces loyal to Salvatore Maranzano were growing stronger. Maranzano had prepared carefully. His followers were disciplined. Many had arrived from the same Sicilian town and trusted each other deeply. Trust can be a powerful weapon in a war. Meanwhile, Masseria's side began experiencing problems. Some of his allies were killed during the conflict. Others started to worry that the war might drag on for years. And when wars drag on, people begin asking uncomfortable questions. Questions like, is this really worth it? Or perhaps the more practical question, are we still making money? Because the truth is, wars are terrible for business. Bootlegging operations became riskier. Gambling houses sometimes closed early. Police attention increased whenever another violent incident occurred. For the younger generation of gangsters, this endless fighting felt pointless. Many of them had joined organized crime to build wealth and influence. Instead, they were watching profits shrink while rivals shot at each other in the streets. And slowly, quietly, some of Masseria's own allies began wondering whether his leadership still made sense. Among those watching the situation carefully was Charles Lucky Luciano. Luciano had spent years building his position within Masseria's organization. But he also believed something important. The future of the mafia needed to change. The old system of one powerful boss ruling everything created too much rivalry, too much pride, too many wars. Luciano imagined something different. A structure where different families shared power, where disputes could be settled through negotiation instead of violence, where organized crime functioned more like a business organization than a medieval kingdom. But before that vision could become reality, one major obstacle remained: Joe Masseria himself. Masseria was not the type of leader who willingly stepped aside. And as the war dragged on, Luciano began quietly considering a very dangerous solution. Because sometimes in the underworld, change arrives through negotiation, and sometimes it arrives through a carefully planned dinner. On a spring day in April of 1931, the war reached one of its most dramatic moments. Joe Masseria was spending time at a restaurant in Coney Island. Restaurants were common meeting places for mafia figures. They offered privacy, good food, and an excuse for long conversations. And Masseria enjoyed good food very much. On this particular afternoon, he was sitting at a table with someone he trusted. The young gangster, Charles Lucky Luciano. The two men were playing cards while eating lunch. The atmosphere was relaxed. Nothing about the scene looked unusual. Two men enjoying a game. Perhaps a little wine. Perhaps a discussion about business. To anyone watching from another table, it probably seemed like an ordinary afternoon. At some point during the meal, Luciano excused himself from the table. He reportedly said he needed to use the restroom. This was not unusual. Nobody at the restaurant thought much about it. But what happened next would change the course of mafia history. While Luciano was away from the table, several gunmen entered the restaurant. They moved quickly. Within seconds, gunfire erupted. Joe Masseria was shot multiple times at the table. The attack was swift and brutal. When the gunmen left, the powerful mafia boss known as Joe the Boss was dead. News of the killing spread quickly through the underworld. For many people inside the mafia world, the meaning was clear. The war had reached a turning point. Without Masseria, his faction no longer had its central leader, and many believed that the Castellamarese side had now achieved victory. But the deeper truth was more complicated, because the killing of Masseria was not simply a victory for Maranzano. It was also part of a much larger plan. A plan quietly supported by Luciano and other members of the younger generation. They believed removing Masseria would end the war and open the door to a new system of leadership. For the moment, however, the official winner appeared to be Salvatore Maranzano, and he was about to claim his prize. With Joe Masseria gone, the Castellamarese War seemed to reach its conclusion. Salvatore Maranzano now stood as the most powerful mafia leader in New York. His supporters celebrated the end of the long conflict. After years of tension and violence, their faction had finally defeated its greatest rival. Maranzano quickly moved to reorganize the structure of the mafia. Drawing inspiration from the systems he admired in ancient Rome, he created a clear hierarchy for the criminal world. New York's mafia organizations were divided into several powerful groups. Each group had its own leader, soldiers, and territory. These organizations would later become famous as the Five Families. The arrangement was meant to bring order to the underworld. Instead of endless rivalries, each family would control its own area and operate under an organized system. But Maranzano also made one decision that would soon create new problems. He declared himself the supreme leader of all mafia families. The title he chose was dramatic, Capo dei Capi, or, in English, Boss of Bosses. To Maranzano, this title represented the authority he believed he had earned through victory. But not everyone agreed with this idea, especially not the younger gangsters who had helped end the war. Men like Luciano had imagined a future where power was shared more evenly. They did not want another single boss controlling everything. After all, replacing one absolute ruler with another did not really solve the problem. Still, for the moment, Maranzano appeared to have complete control. He held meetings with mafia leaders across New York. He reorganized territories. He explained the new system of families and ranks. Outwardly, the war seemed finished. But beneath the surface, tension was beginning to grow again. Because Maranzano had another quality that often appears in powerful leaders: paranoia. He had defeated his greatest rival. But now, he began to worry about the ambitious younger figures rising around him. Men like Lucky Luciano. And in the mafia world, when powerful leaders become suspicious, they sometimes start making dangerous decisions. Very dangerous decisions. The Castellamarese War might have ended, but the struggle for control of the mafia was not over yet. Not even close. After the death of Giuseppe Masseria, the long and bloody conflict seemed to have finally reached its end. The underworld of New York took a quiet breath. For many gangsters, the war had been exhausting. Too many funerals, too many nights watching the door of a restaurant, wondering if gunmen might appear. Now, there was a new leader, Salvatore Maranzano. Maranzano quickly moved to establish control over the entire mafia structure in the city. He was not interested in chaos. He believed strongly in order and hierarchy. In his mind, the mafia should operate like a well-organized army. And in that army, he would be the general. Soon after the war ended, Maranzano gathered many important mafia figures in New York for a meeting. There, he explained his new system. The underworld would be divided into several major organizations, each with its own leader. These groups would later become known as the 5 families. Each family would have a boss, an underboss, and crews of soldiers who carried out the daily operations. The structure was neat and organized, almost military in style. Maranzano was very proud of it. He even compared the system to the structure of the Roman Empire, which he admired deeply. Some of the men at the meeting nodded politely. Others listened quietly. And a few may have wondered if this was becoming a history lecture. But nobody interrupted, because Maranzano also made something very clear. Above all the families, there would be one supreme leader, himself. He took the title Capo dei Capi, the boss of bosses. To Maranzano, this made perfect sense. After all, he had just won a major war. His enemies had been defeated. His organization was now the strongest. But to many of the younger gangsters in the room, the title felt uncomfortably familiar, because not long ago, another powerful boss had believed he controlled the entire mafia, and that belief had led directly to war. Among those listening carefully that day was the ambitious gangster Charles Lucky Luciano. Luciano had helped bring an end to the conflict by supporting the removal of Masseria. He had imagined a new future for organized crime, a system where leaders worked together rather than fighting constantly for control. But Maranzano's new structure looked suspiciously like the old one. One powerful boss sitting at the very top. And history had already shown how dangerous that could be. At first, Luciano and the other younger leaders remained quiet. There was no reason to start another war immediately after the previous one had ended. But Maranzano soon began creating problems of his own, because power can change people. And sometimes, victory brings something else along with it: suspicion. In the months following the end of the war, something strange began to happen inside Maranzano's organization. The new boss of bosses started hearing rumors that some younger gangsters might be too ambitious, rumors that certain men could become threats. And when powerful leaders begin worrying about threats, they sometimes decide to remove those threats before they grow stronger. Maranzano reportedly began creating lists of people he no longer trusted. Unfortunately for them, one of the names that appeared on those lists was Charles Lucky Luciano. Luciano had become very influential. He had strong alliances across several mafia groups. From Maranzano's perspective, that made him dangerous. Meanwhile, Luciano was also hearing rumors that Maranzano might be planning to eliminate several younger leaders. Rumors that the new boss wanted to secure his power before anyone could challenge him. In the mafia world, rumors like these were rarely ignored, because sometimes they turned out to be very true. Luciano began discussing the situation with trusted allies, men like Vito Genovese and others from the younger generation. They all understood the danger. If Maranzano moved first, many of them might disappear. But if they acted before him, the future of the mafia could change. So Luciano began quietly organizing a plan, and the plan required careful timing. Direct confrontation would be risky. Maranzano still had loyal soldiers protecting him. Instead, Luciano decided to use a trick, a clever one. The plan involved sending men to Maranzano's office pretending to be government agents. If the guards believed the visitors were officials investigating financial crimes, they might allow them inside without resistance. Once inside, the outcome would be decided very quickly. The group chosen for this job included several trusted gunmen. They were instructed to move fast and avoid unnecessary noise. After all, assassinations are rarely improved by long speeches, and the final chapter of the Castellamarese War was about to begin. On a September day in 1931, Salvatore Maranzano arrived at his office in Manhattan. From the outside, it looked like a normal business location. Nothing dramatic, just another office in a busy city. But inside those walls sat the most powerful mafia leader in America, the man who had declared himself boss of bosses. Maranzano spent the morning walking through his usual tasks, meetings, discussions, business matters. At some point during the day, several men arrived at the office. They introduced themselves as government agents, investigators, the kind of people most businessmen would prefer not to see. But the story sounded believable. Financial investigations were common during that era, and the guards allowed the visitors inside. What happened next unfolded very quickly. Once inside the office, the supposed agents revealed their true purpose. The gunmen attacked. Within moments, Salvatore Maranzano was dead. The man who had won the Castellamarese War had ruled the mafia for only a few months. His reign as boss of bosses was over almost as quickly as it had begun. News of the assassination spread rapidly through the underworld. But something interesting happened. There was no new war, no immediate revenge attacks. Instead, many mafia leaders accepted the change surprisingly quickly. Because behind the scenes, Luciano and his allies had already prepared a new system, a system designed to prevent exactly the kind of power struggle that had caused the Castellamarese War in the first place. The title of boss of bosses would disappear. No single leader would control everything. Instead, a group of powerful bosses would form a council, a commission. Together, they would settle disputes and manage the affairs of organized crime. It was a radical idea for the time. But after years of violence and rivalry, many leaders were ready for something different. The Castellamarese War had finally come to an end. Two powerful bosses had fallen, and from the chaos of that conflict, a new era of organized crime was about to begin. After the sudden death of Salvatore Maranzano, the mafia world waited. Everyone expected something. Another war, perhaps. Another round of revenge killings. That had been the pattern for years. One boss falls, another rises, and the cycle begins again. But this time, something different happened. Instead of chaos, there was a strange sort of calm. Behind the scenes, the ambitious gangster Charles Lucky Luciano had already begun putting a new plan into motion. Luciano understood something important about the mafia world. The constant wars were bad for business. They attracted police attention. They interrupted profitable operations like gambling and bootlegging. And perhaps, most importantly, they made it difficult for criminals to trust each other. Luciano believed organized crime should operate more like a corporation, not a kingdom ruled by a single powerful boss. So instead of claiming the title of boss of bosses for himself, Luciano did something unexpected. He abolished the position entirely. No more capo dei capi, no more supreme ruler of the mafia. Instead, Luciano introduced a new system, a council, a governing body made up of several mafia leaders. This council became known as the Commission. The idea was simple. Major decisions would be discussed by the bosses together. Disputes between families could be settled without starting wars. If one organization had a problem with another, the Commission would act as a kind of court. It was not exactly a peaceful system. After all, this was still organized crime. But it was far more stable than the old system. The 5 major mafia families of New York each had a seat at the table. And instead of competing for one supreme throne, they shared power. It was a remarkable change. And it worked surprisingly well. Because once the fighting stopped, the criminal world could return to what it did best: making money. Lots of it. The end of the Castellamarese War changed the structure of organized crime in America forever. Before the war, the mafia had been divided by old traditions and rivalries. Many leaders came directly from Sicily and followed strict customs from the old country. But the new generation of gangsters saw things differently. Men like Charles Lucky Luciano and Vito Genovese had grown up in the United States. They understood American cities, American business, and American opportunity. And they wanted the mafia to adapt. With the Commission in place, organized crime entered a new era. The 5 families of New York became powerful institutions. Each family controlled its own territory and operations. Gambling networks expanded. Loan-sharking businesses grew. Smuggling operations became more sophisticated. Even after the end of Prohibition in the United States, the mafia found new ways to make money. Construction contracts, labor unions, nightclubs, casinos. The criminal empire spread far beyond the neighborhoods where it had first begun. And for many years, the Commission helped prevent the kind of large-scale war that had once threatened to destroy the entire organization. Of course, this did not mean the mafia became peaceful. There were still murders, still betrayals, still secret plots whispered in quiet restaurants. But the structure held. The Castellamarese War had forced the mafia to evolve. It had pushed the criminal world to modernize. And in a strange way, it had turned organized crime into something more organized than ever before. When historians look back at the Castellamarese War today, they often describe it as the final battle between 2 generations of mafia leaders. On one side stood the old bosses, men like Giuseppe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano. They had grown up in the traditions of Sicily. Their leadership style came from a time when loyalty to a single boss meant everything. Power was personal. Honor was serious business. And leadership was often decided through violence. On the other side stood a younger generation. Men who grew up in America. Men who thought less about old traditions and more about modern opportunity. They wanted organized crime to run efficiently, like a business. And in the end, that younger generation won. The war that had started as a struggle between 2 powerful bosses ended with a complete transformation of the mafia system. The old title of boss of bosses disappeared. The Commission took its place, and the underworld entered a new chapter. Of course, for the people living in New York during those years, much of this remained invisible. Families continued eating dinner together. Children continued playing in the streets. Restaurants stayed busy late into the night. Most ordinary people never saw the hidden meetings or quiet deals that shaped the criminal world around them. And perhaps that was exactly how the Mafia preferred it. Because the most powerful systems are often the ones that operate quietly, hidden beneath the surface, just like the city itself. New York has always been called the city that never sleeps. Even late at night, the sound of traffic drifts through the streets. Lights glow in apartment windows. Somewhere, someone is always awake. In the early 1930s, as the Castellamarese War came to an end, the city continued moving forward just as it always had. Taxis rolled past restaurants. Ships arrived at the harbor. New immigrants stepped onto American soil for the first time. Most of them had no idea that a hidden war had just reshaped the criminal world beneath their feet. But in quiet offices and back room across the city, new leaders were already building something different. A new system, a new structure, a new era of organized crime. The war between Giuseppe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano had ended. But the legacy of that conflict would echo through the decades that followed. Because from the chaos of that war, the modern mafia was born. And like the city itself, it would continue evolving, quietly, patiently, in the shadows.